This video is sponsored by Creative Assembly. Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today I have the joy of talking to you about my favorite Total War game of all time. I've played these games since the first one in the series, and when the folks at Creative Assembly asked me if I'd like to talk about what is essentially one of my favorite games from my childhood, how could I say no? Now, whether you're a recent convert to the world of Total War games, a veteran of the series, or simply a curious outsider, I can always wholeheartedly recommend Medieval 2 as one of, if not the best game in the series. Despite its age, having released in 2006 with a follow-up definitive edition released with the Kingdom's expansion included, Medieval 2 is a bit of a gold standard that we can always look back to for a variety of reasons. And if you find yourself never having played or not recently having played the game, I can, again, highly recommend checking it out so you can see what all the hype is about. Medieval 2 Total War was the first numbered sequel in the series. Sequels don't really mean story progression or anything in this context, but this was the first time Total War decided to go back to an era they'd already covered and approach it with all the new mechanics and lessons learned from the previous games, including the adaptation of the era to the new engine. And though it is old and many newer fans of the series may have never played it, it is a game that is consistently brought up as this aforementioned gold standard. It had its own issues that the series has since refined, and parts of it certainly feel dated. It is an old game after all, but there are many core gameplay systems and principles in the game that shine even now, just shy of 14 years since its release, at least at the time of this recording. The first thing that really sets this game apart is its setting. The medieval era is interesting for many reasons, and Europe in particular went through quite a bit over the course of the entirety of the era. Medieval 2 focuses on the part with everything from crusades and jihads, to bustling cities and imposing castles, to knights and trebuchets, to guns and cannons. A setting like this naturally brings with it variety. Each faction had its strengths and weaknesses ebb and flow depending on how far along the world was technologically, and depending on its starting position, everything from the foes to the politics and even terrain you'd face might be wildly different. When it came to building up your settlements, the structures were fairly similar, maybe the occasional standout building or a different name to serve a similar purpose between cultures, but with units, not only were the colors and banners vibrant and eye-catching, but each faction had its own flavor units as well. Sure, there were some overlapping archetypes. A peasant with a spear is a peasant with a spear, but then you've got the Zweihanders, the Longbowmen, the Nafatun, the Hobilars, the Camel Gunners, the Highlanders, the Grand Bombards, the Sipahi, the Varangian Guards, the Musketeers, the Musketeers, the Musketeers, and these? With a simple text edit, you could unlock all the factions in the game, including the ones you weren't supposed to be able to play as, and you could rampage around as the Pope himself. And all of this gets pushed even further with the Kingdom's campaigns that come as a part of the definitive edition. If the great varieties of medieval Europe get too boring for you somehow, why not focus on early colonization of the Americas, or the Northern Crusades, or Britannia, or the Third and Fourth Crusades? The setting is really a difficult one to top. Now, I'm not saying there haven't been other eras with just as much stuff going on, but of the eras that the Total War series has covered so far, this certainly tops the list as having not just the most cultural and unit variety, but also a giant leap in technology happening in the middle of it, while also featuring religion and politics as a prominent factor. Now, the setting is great, but the way it translates into gameplay is what's most important. We are talking about a game, after all. Provinces in Medieval 2 Total War are entirely centralized around one settlement, and though it could be argued that having multiple settlements in one province has its benefits, the way these settlements worked here is very interesting. Settlements existed in two forms, and you, as the player, could make the strategic decision with regards to converting from one to another. Castles had access to better unit recruitment options, while cities were meant to be economic hubs. Neither came with their own garrison. You'd have to recruit and maintain the garrisons yourself, and both resulted in some pretty epic backdrops for battles. These settlements grew naturally as a result of population over time, and all you could do was influence this growth by building the right buildings or having the right people in charge. And as these populations crossed certain thresholds, you could upgrade the cities and castles and gain access to higher tier buildings. There was no technology tree, just a building tree with higher technology units unavailable in smaller settlements. Now, some of the most interesting buildings in how they were obtained were the guilds. The opportunity to build these only came along if you fulfilled specific requirements that the game doesn't make crystal clear on the front end. The concept here is such a great execution of how guilds didn't just crop up anywhere, but where artisans of a certain sort already existed at a certain scale. And some of these guilds were harder to get than others, and some offered particularly interesting units as long as you fulfilled other criteria. You didn't just have access to every building because you were the player, you had to make an active effort. And without a limit to building slots, you had to force yourself to build with your own limitations on how and when to spend money and what to build, what to prioritize, and how to specialize each city. And that's not all. The setup of your cities and castles directly impacted your wars. See, armies in Medieval 2 could be recruited without a general at their head, and reinforcements could be dispatched from multiple settlements at a time, but they had to actively move through potentially dangerous terrain to get to their destination. You controlled the arrival path of those reinforcements. Now, different units were available in different amounts, and the recruitment pool had to replenish before you'd have access to more of that unit, and units of different types moved at different speeds on the campaign map. An army was only as fast as the slowest unit within, so sometimes you could separate your army into smaller parts to, say, cut off incoming reinforcements or chase down a threat that's just out of reach of your marching infantry. Even armies that had a general in charge couldn't magically conjure reinforcements from across the kingdom he served. At best, he'd be able to recruit mercenaries that would supply him troops based on the region he was located in, and in a worst-case scenario, he could build a fort where he might await reinforcements. And that's not all. Damaged troops didn't simply replenish while out on the field. You had to march the army to a nearby city or castle and retrain those troops. And you could only do that if the settlement had the appropriate structure required to recruit the unit in the first place. Now, I know not everybody loved this approach to replenishing troops and providing reinforcements, but this all added some weight to losing not just units, but individuals within those units, especially high-tier units that might not always be readily available at the front. But this also wasn't the only reason to retrain units either. Certain buildings could be built to improve their armor or weapons, and while these improvements would apply to new recruits automatically, the only way to acquire those upgrades on old units was to retrain them. And just as a quick sidebar, these improvements would actually make visual changes to the units on the battlefield. You'd be able to see the difference between the unarmored, the leather-padded, and the plate-covered variants of the same unit. It is such a wonderful touch on the battlefield, just adding that extra layer of connection between campaign and battle maps. As a player, you feel like you've actually seen results from your actions. You built a building, you retrained your troops, and now they look different on the battlefield, they look safer, they look better equipped. It's just that small touch that makes such a big difference, and Medieval 2 is full of these small touches. Outside of war, Medieval 2 tried to push other aspects of the era quite a bit. Settlements provided you with a fairly detailed breakdown as to their situation, from growth rate to public order to religious breakdown, etc., etc. And if you really wanted to challenge yourself, you could play with a setting that only allowed you to manage settlements if you had a character present as a governor. Diplomacy was an endeavor. You'd have to recruit a diplomat and physically send them to a foreign city or general-led army in order to engage in diplomacy. Alternatively, if you were gifted with a bunch of daughters, you could send them over to engage in diplomacy or to convince foreign generals to marry them and join your faction instead. Now, diplomatic options themselves were relatively simple, but trade was interestingly represented at a city level, and it was made even more interesting by the second, non-diplomatic layer of it. Sending out merchants to trade goods wasn't entirely efficient at all times, but it was certainly an interesting idea. These merchants would trade goods that were littered across the map, but they'd also look to buy out opposing merchants if possible. Meanwhile, spies and assassins went about doing their business, including hiding in settlements that you might want to attack, potentially opening the gates for you when a siege battle began. And priests and imams went around spreading your faith to reduce religious friction, or when used offensively, increase it. If you played as a Catholic nation, you try to make sure the Pope is happy, and you risk excommunication if you make the wrong moves, especially against friends of the Pope. And excommunication actually had some consequences to it. Your people would be upset, other Catholic nations would be more likely to declare war on you, they wouldn't like you as much. It was amazing. It was scary. But with the right moves, you could find yourself in the College of Cardinals holding a decent bit of power in your own hands. Enough favor with the Pope allows you to ask him to call a crusade, while as a Muslim faction, your imam can call a jihad. Crusader and jihadi armies gained certain benefits, but at the end of the day, getting involved was driven by roleplay, which is another excellent element of Medieval 2, executed in a few different ways that feel so very involved. Characters join your faction in a few ways. Marriage and birth bring them directly into your family tree, but adoption and exceptional performance on the battlefield can do the same. These characters can either sit back at settlements as governors, or they can march out to fight in battle. Agents are also characters, princesses coming from your family tree, but everybody else is recruited from the appropriate buildings. And while agents are relatively simpler, they, as well as your generals and governors, have attributes that affect how well they do their tasks, and they're able to obtain traits and ancillaries. And sure, traits and ancillaries are standard affair now, but Medieval 2 Total War had an impressively extensive system behind them. Depending on battles fought, the odds of said battles, actions taken in those battles, such as fighting, having unit health drop to a certain threshold but still surviving, and of course the results of these battles. These were all major factors. Attacking in a siege, defending in a siege, ending your turn at sea or in a settlement, or just outside a settlement, or ending it with a certain percentage of movement points left over. These were all factors too. Parents having certain traits, surviving an assassination attempt, training units in a city with certain tax thresholds, being in a city with certain structures. These were factors. There were so many factors that came together to develop into traits for your characters. It really felt like these people were actual individuals growing as people depending on what they did, and they did the things they had access to. Taverns in a settlement meant one thing. Being out on the field all the time meant another. These traits and ancillaries were so well implemented, and when I play RPGs, tabletop or otherwise, I love this system of leveling up through doing rather than simply spending points. Medieval 2 executed this amazingly. Now these traits and ancillaries could do anything from buff or debuff, trade skill or public order or command ability, strengthen certain battle types, or how easy or hard it was to target somebody for assassination. Lots of things these traits and ancillaries did, but as far as the traits were concerned, the single coolest thing these traits could do, pure style points here, the coolest thing these traits could do was give a character an epithet. Lead well and go from a promising commander up the chain to a legendary commander. Now this person is known as the Mighty. Do the opposite and become a useless commander, be known as the Inept instead. Man, 16-year-old me in 2006 thought these were awesome, and 29-year-old me in 2020 thinks they're just as awesome. Seeing your characters reach this level of accomplishment felt great. The Bastion, the Profane, the Cunning, the Unstoppable, the Saint, the Cruel, the Doomsayer, and many, many more. Not just for your generals and governors, but for agents too. And when they reach that level, when they reach that status, where the whole world knew who they were at this level, man, it felt good as a player to hit that mark. And what's more, these traits would be reflected on the battlefield through generals' speeches. Just another way to bring these characters to life, hearing them talk about the battle at hand, the enemies, who they were, and how they led. And how good they were at name-calling, I guess.
Collection of sausage-eating, beer-swilling, imperial pudding heads. I think they will welcome us.
From the setting, to how the setting translated to mechanics, to the varied cultures and technologies, to the surprisingly deep roleplay mechanics, to yes, even some visual elements like having dirt and blood collecting on armor over the course of a battle, or visible unit upgrades, Medieval 2 Total War is a classic in many ways. It has all the hallmarks of what makes a great Total War game, a little something for everyone, and it still stands out as the bar to meet in many aspects. Of course, there are ways to refine what Medieval 2 had to make it better, and sure, it had some weird ahistoric elements too, like Sherwood archers and battlefield assassins and these. But there's a lot that Medieval 2 nailed, which is why you'll often see folks clamoring for more of the same. It was a brilliant game on its own, and I haven't even touched on the extremely active mod scene. From the stainless steels, to the broken crescents, to Europa Barbarum 2s, all the way to the Lord of the Rings Third Ages and Call of Warhammers, the mods are plentiful and thorough. There are total conversions, there are balance mods, there are realism mods, and there are mods that just add new factions or units to existing factions. And these mods all continue to get such a great degree of love. Mods extend the shelf life of a game, and here we are, nearly a decade and a half after release, still recommending and playing Medieval 2 Total War, the greatest Total War of all time. I'm very curious to hear everybody else's opinion on the Total War series. There are some die-hard fans for almost every entry into the series, and I'm curious to know what game draws you in the most and why. Let me know in the comments below. I've been playing Total War games for over 2/3 of my life, so there is definitely a bit of passion for the subject, and throughout all these years, Medieval 2 still stands out to me. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons for supporting the channel on a monthly basis. You keep us alive and running smoothly. And a big old thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.